Professor Zekthara had been teaching interspecies military history at the Galactic Defense Academy for approximately 300 cycles. And in all that time, she had never encountered a species quite like humans. Oh, she'd heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? But seeing them in person was, well, it was something else entirely. The towering, crystalline Vorthak professor stood before her mixed class of various galactic species, her four eyes scanning the room with what could generously be called academic patience. Today's lesson was on the concept of proportional response in warfare, a topic that most civilized species understood intuitively. You use exactly enough force to neutralize a threat. No more, no less. Simple mathematics, really. Now then, Zekthara began, her voice creating harmonic resonances that translated beautifully across species barriers. Can anyone provide me with an example of what your species would consider overkill in a military context? Several tentacles shot up from the mollusk consortium representative. Professor, when the Rebel Mining Guild took one of our outer asteroid facilities, we responded by sending 12 dreadnoughts instead of the tactically optimal 8. The excess force was considered rather unseemly by our parliament. Excellent example, Glub Morton. 50% over optimal force deployment, most inappropriate. Zekthara's approval resonated through her crystalline structure. Anyone else? The insectoid hive captain Zach clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. My Queen Mother once authorized the deployment of 3,000 warrior drones to suppress a rebellion that could have been handled by 1,500. The waste of resources haunted her for cycles. Also quite good. Double the necessary force. Zekthara turned her attention to the back of the classroom, where 3 humans sat with expressions that could only be described as barely contained amusement. And what about our human students? Surely you have some examples of excessive force from your military history? The 3 humans exchanged glances. Captain Rodriguez nudged Lieutenant Chen, who in turn elbowed Gunnery Sergeant Williams. It was Williams who finally stood up, and Zekthara noticed that several other species in the classroom instinctively leaned away from the human. Well, Professor, Williams began, his voice carrying that particular mixture of respect and barely suppressed laughter that Zekthara was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. I think I might have an example for you, but I brought footage. Zekthara's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. Footage. Please, proceed, Gunnery Sergeant. Williams pulled out a small human device and connected it to the classroom's holographic display system. The other students leaned forward with interest. Surely the humans, being a relatively young species, would have some quaint example of using perhaps twice the necessary force for a military objective. The hologram flickered to life, showing what appeared to be a primitive human military installation. The image quality suggested it was ancient by human standards, perhaps from their early spacefaring period. This, Williams said, his tone taking on the practiced cadence of a military briefer, is footage from what we call Operation Desert Storm, specifically the Battle of 73 Easting. The year was 1991 by our calendar. Zekthara settled in to watch what she assumed would be a minor skirmish demonstrating a modest excess of force. The other students did likewise, expecting perhaps a brief lesson in human military inefficiency. The situation, Williams continued, was that an enemy force of approximately 150 armored vehicles was occupying defensive positions. Standard galactic doctrine would suggest deploying roughly equivalent numbers, perhaps 200 vehicles to ensure victory with minimal losses. Quite reasonable, Zekthara murmured approvingly. I assume you humans deployed 300? 400? William's grin widened in that predatory way that made most species uncomfortable. Not exactly, Professor. The footage began to play, and immediately, Zekthara realized something was wrong. The view was from some sort of human aircraft, flying at enormous speed. The landscape below was a desert, scarred by what appeared to be massive impact craters. The actual human response, Williams narrated as the footage rolled, involved approximately 2,000 armored vehicles, 1,800 artillery pieces, 500 attack helicopters, 300 fixed-wing aircraft, and roughly 300,000 human soldiers. The classroom fell silent. Even the usually talkative mollusk stopped bubbling. "I'm sorry," Zekthara said carefully, her harmonic voice wavering slightly. "Did you say 300,000 soldiers against 150 vehicles?" "Oh, that's just for this one engagement, Professor. The overall operation involved about 700,000 humans and our allies." On the holographic display, explosions began blooming across the desert landscape like deadly flowers. The camera angle shifted, showing human vehicles advancing in perfect formation while the horizon lit up with constant flashes of artillery impacts. "You see?" Williams continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than documenting wholesale destruction. "The enemy had made the mistake of invading an ally of ours. Now, the proportional response would have been to push them back across the border. Mission accomplished, everybody goes home." The footage showed a human tank firing its main gun. The projectile covered several kilometers in what appeared to be mere seconds, obliterating an enemy vehicle in a spectacular explosion. "Instead," Williams said, his voice now carrying that distinctly human mix of pride and dark humor, "we decided to demonstrate what we call overwhelming force. The idea being that if you're going to fight, you might as well make sure the other guy never wants to fight you again." Glub Morton raised a tentacle nervously. "Gunnery, Sergeant, what was the final casualty ratio?" Williams paused the footage and turned to face the class. His expression was completely serious now. "In this particular engagement, the human forces destroyed approximately 85 enemy tanks, 40 armored personnel carriers, 30 artillery pieces, and 100 other vehicles. Total enemy casualties were estimated at around 600. "And human casualties?" Zekthara asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. 6 wounded. No deaths." The silence in the classroom was profound enough that you could have heard a pin drop if anyone had been careless enough to drop one. Hive Captain Zach's mandibles clicked nervously. "I'm sorry. But did you say 6 wounded versus 600 enemy casualties?" "That's correct. And before you ask, that wasn't unusual for this conflict. The total casualty ratio for the entire war was approximately 300 enemy deaths for every human death." Lieutenant Chen leaned forward from her seat. "Sergeant Williams, why don't you tell them about the highway?" Williams' grin returned, somehow managing to be both apologetic and terrifying. "Right, the highway. Professor, what you're about to see is what happened when the enemy tried to retreat from our capital city back to their own country." The footage shifted to an aerial view of a long stretch of road cutting through the desert. At first, it looked like a normal highway, perhaps crowded with traffic. "This," Williams said, "is what we came to call the Highway of Death." As the camera zoomed in, it became clear that the dark shapes on the road weren't normal traffic. They were burned-out vehicles, twisted metal, and debris stretching for kilometers in both directions. The retreating enemy force consisted of approximately 2,000 vehicles, Williams narrated with professional detachment. Our response was to deploy every available aircraft in the theater. The attack lasted approximately 2 hours. The footage showed wave after wave of human aircraft diving down to attack the stranded convoy. Explosions rippled along the highway like a deadly chain reaction. Professor Zekthara's crystalline structure was beginning to dim, a sign of extreme distress in her species. Gunnery Sergeant. Surely this was considered excessive even by human standards? Actually, Professor, there was some debate about that. Some humans thought we should have let more of them escape. More escape? Glubba Morton bubbled in confusion. How many did escape? From this particular convoy? About 12 vehicles, maybe 15. The classroom erupted in shocked chattering in a dozen different languages and communication methods. Zekthara had to pulse her bioluminescent teaching beacon several times to restore order. Please, everyone, calm yourselves. Gunnery Sergeant Williams, surely this represents the absolute pinnacle of human overkill. Williams exchanged another look with his fellow humans. Captain Rodriguez nodded slightly, and Williams turned back to the class with an expression that somehow managed to convey both regret and anticipation. Well, Professor, that depends on how you define overkill. Because this was actually considered a pretty restrained response by our standards. Zekthara's 4 eyes focused on Williams with laser intensity. What do you mean by restrained? I mean, we only used conventional weapons. The temperature in the classroom seemed to drop several degrees. Every species present had heard whispers about human unconventional weapons, but the details were generally classified at levels far above their security clearances. You see, Williams continued, apparently oblivious to the growing tension. This enemy had used chemical weapons against civilian populations. Now, according to human military doctrine, the proportional response to chemical weapons is chemical weapons. That seems logical, Zekthara managed. Except we'd signed treaties saying we wouldn't use chemical weapons anymore. So we had to get creative. Lieutenant Chen stood up. Would you like to tell them about the daisy cutters, Sergeant? Oh, that's good thinking, Lieutenant. Williams turned back to the holographic display and switched to a new piece of footage. This is what we call a BLU-82, or daisy cutter. It's a conventional explosive weapon weighing approximately 15,000 pounds. The footage showed a massive explosion that seemed to consume everything within several kilometers. The shockwave was visible as it rippled outward from ground zero. The blast radius, Williams noted conversationally, is roughly equivalent to a small tactical nuclear weapon minus the radiation. Hive Captain Zach's wings began buzzing with anxiety. You created non-nuclear weapons with nuclear-level destructive power. Oh, that's nothing. Captain Rodriguez chimed in helpfully. Tell them about the Moab. Williams actually chuckled. The Moab is our massive ordnance air blast bomb. It weighs about 21,000 pounds and has a blast radius of approximately 1.6 kilometers. We call it the mother of all bombs. Please tell me you didn't use these weapons in this conflict, Zekthara pleaded. No, Professor, we didn't. Like I said, we were being restrained. We only used them in later conflicts. The silence that followed was so complete that the ventilation system seemed loud by comparison. Glubby Morton finally found his voice. Gunnery Sergeant, I'm almost afraid to ask, but what would constitute an unrestrained human response? Williams paused, looking thoughtful. Well, there was that time we vaporized 2 entire cities to end a war. You what? Oh, don't worry. That was way back in 1945. We've gotten much more efficient since then. More efficient? Zekthara's voice cracked slightly. Lieutenant Chen helpfully pulled up another file on her personal device. Would you like to see our current nuclear arsenal, Professor? It's mostly declassified these days. Before Zekthara could object, the holographic display filled with charts, graphs, and technical specifications that made the entire classroom recoil in horror. The numbers were incomprehensible. Megatons, delivery systems, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers. According to our last treaty, Williams noted, reading from the display, we're only allowed to have about 1,250 deployed nuclear warheads, down from a peak of around 31,000. 31,000. Hive Captain Zach's voice rose to a screech that caused several species to cover their auditory organs. Per side, Captain Rodriguez added helpfully. The Soviets had about the same number. The Soviets? Other humans. We had a bit of a disagreement for about 50 years. Never actually fought directly, though. Too dangerous. Zekthara's crystalline structure was now flickering erratically. Are you telling me that humans built enough nuclear weapons to destroy their entire planet multiple times over because of a disagreement? Several times over, Williams confirmed. Current estimates suggest our combined arsenals at their peak could have rendered Earth uninhabitable for about 10,000 years. But you never used them? Well, not the big ones. We did test them occasionally, just to make sure they worked. The holographic display switched to footage of nuclear tests, showing mushroom clouds rising into the atmosphere while commentators discussed yield measurements in megatons. This one, Williams pointed to a particularly massive explosion, was about 50 megatons. We built it just to see if we could. Did you ever consider, Zekthara asked weakly, that this might be slightly excessive? Williams looked genuinely puzzled. Excessive? Professor, with respect, I don't think you understand the human approach to military planning. Please, enlighten me. The way we see it, the enemy has made the choice to fight us. At that point, our job isn't to have a fair fight. Our job is to end the fight as quickly as possible with minimum casualties on our side. Lieutenant Chen nodded enthusiastically. It's really quite humane when you think about it. Quick, decisive action saves lives in the long run. By destroying everything in sight? Not everything, Captain Rodriguez objected. We're very precise. We only destroy what we need to destroy to achieve our objectives. And what we need to destroy, Williams added, is the enemy's will to fight. Not just their ability to fight today, but their desire to fight us ever again. The holographic display cycled through more footage. Precision-guided munitions threading through windows, naval bombardments that could be heard from orbit, artillery barrages that reshaped geography. You see, Professor, Williams continued, most species approach warfare like it's some kind of mathematical equation. Deploy X forces to counter Y enemy forces, minimize losses, achieve objectives. That's correct. It's the rational approach. But humans don't see warfare as rational. We see it as a problem to be solved permanently. So when someone decides to fight us, we don't just fight back. We demonstrate that fighting humans is the worst decision anyone can make. Glubba Morton bubbled nervously. But surely there must be limits. Rules of engagement? Proportional response? Williams looked at his fellow humans, who both shrugged. Well, we do try to avoid civilian casualties when possible, and we generally don't use biological weapons anymore. Chemical weapons are right out. We sign treaties. What about the nuclear weapons? What about them? You said you'd use them if necessary? William's expression became completely serious. Gunnery Sergeant, let me put this in perspective for you. If someone threatens Earth, threatens humanity's survival, then yes, we will use every weapon in our arsenal, all of them, at once. The classroom fell silent again. But, Rodriguez added cheerfully, that's really a last resort scenario. Most of the time, we just use conventional forces, like the 300,000 soldiers against 150 vehicles. Exactly. See, you're getting it now. Zekthara's teaching beacon pulsed weakly. I'm not sure I am. Help me understand the human logic here. William stood up and walked to the front of the classroom, his demeanor shifting into full instructor mode. Professor, every species here today approaches conflict with the goal of winning while minimizing cost and casualties, correct? Of course. Humans approach conflict with the goal of never having to fight that particular enemy again. Ever. I see. No, I don't think you do. Let me give you another example. Williams pulled up a new file. This is from our conflict in Afghanistan, early 21st century. A small group of enemy fighters was hiding in a cave system. The footage showed a barren mountainside with what appeared to be a cave entrance. Standard galactic doctrine would suggest sending in ground forces to clear the caves, right? Maybe lose a few dozen soldiers, neutralize the threat. Mission accomplished. Several students nodded in agreement. Instead, we used something called a massive ordnance penetrator. 30,000 pounds of explosive designed to penetrate bunkers and underground facilities. The footage showed an aircraft dropping what looked like a small building. When it impacted, the entire mountainside simply ceased to exist. Problem solved, Williams noted with satisfaction. No human casualties, and I guarantee you nobody wanted to use those caves again. Hive Captain Zach's wings were buzzing so frantically he was beginning to hover. But the cost, the resources, the complete destruction of the landscape. Much cheaper than rebuilding after a prolonged conflict, Lieutenant Chen pointed out reasonably. Much faster, too. And the psychological effect on other potential enemies, Rodriguez added, is invaluable. When word gets around that humans will drop a mountain on you for hiding in a cave, people tend to reconsider their life choices. Professor Zekthara had been teaching long enough to recognize when she was out of her depth. This was definitely one of those times. Gunnery Sergeant Williams, she said carefully. In all your examples, you've shown humans using overwhelming force against relatively minor threats. Has there ever been a situation where humans faced an enemy of equal or superior strength? The three humans exchanged looks again, and Zekthara was beginning to realize that this particular expression meant she probably didn't want to hear the answer to her question. Well, Professor, Williams said slowly, there was World War II. Tell me about it. Are you sure? It's kind of a long story. I have time. Williams sighed and pulled up what appeared to be a historical overview. World War II was a conflict between roughly half the human nations on one side and the other half on the other side. It lasted about 6 years and involved approximately 100 million human soldiers. That's more soldiers than some species have individuals. The total human casualties, Williams continued, were estimated at between 70 and 85 million deaths. The classroom was so quiet that individual heartbeats were audible. The interesting thing about World War II, Rodriguez picked up the narrative, was that it demonstrated what happens when humans fight other humans without any restraint. We developed new technologies specifically for killing other humans more efficiently, Chen added. Radar, jet engines, rockets, computers, nuclear weapons, improved metallurgy, advanced chemistry, mass production techniques, logistics systems that could supply armies on the other side of the planet. The technological advancement during those 6 years, Williams noted, was roughly equivalent to what most species achieve over several centuries. Zekthara's crystalline structure had stopped flickering and was now pulsing a deep, worried blue. You're telling me that humans developed centuries' worth of technology in 6 years because you were fighting each other? War has always been humanity's greatest motivator for innovation, Rodriguez confirmed. Nothing makes humans more creative than trying to kill other humans more efficiently than those humans are trying to kill them. But that's... Zekthara struggled for words. That's insane. It's effective, Williams corrected. By the end of World War II, humans had developed weapons that could destroy cities in seconds, aircraft that could fly faster than sound, rockets that could reach space, and communication systems that could coordinate operations across entire continents. And this was in the 1940s? That's correct. We've gotten much better since then. Glubba Morton raised a tentacle hesitantly. What happened after the war ended? We rebuilt everything, Chen said simply. Then we used all that new technology to explore space, cure diseases, and generally improve life for everyone. But you kept the weapons? Of course we kept the weapons. We might need them again. Zekthara realized that her concept of overkill and the human concept of overkill existed in completely different universes. What she considered excessive force, humans considered a light police action. What humans considered restrained, most species would consider an extinction-level event. Gunnery Sergeant Williams, she said finally, I believe I understand your point about overkill. But let me ask you this. Is there anything that humans would consider too much force? Williams thought for a moment. Well, we generally try not to damage things we want to keep afterward. Such as hospitals, schools, cultural sites, agricultural land, industrial infrastructure that we might want to use later. What about enemy civilians? We try to minimize civilian casualties when possible. It's bad for morale and makes rebuilding harder afterward. I notice you said minimize, not avoid. Williams shrugged. Sometimes civilian casualties are unavoidable. The enemy made the choice to fight us. At that point, their civilian safety is their responsibility, not ours. That's... Zekthara paused, trying to find the right words. That's remarkably cold-blooded. It's pragmatic, Rodriguez corrected. Humans learned a long time ago that being nice to enemies just encourages them to keep fighting. So, your solution is to be so overwhelmingly destructive that no one wants to fight you? It works, Chen pointed out. When was the last time anyone attacked Earth? Zekthara consulted her historical databases. I can't find any records of anyone attacking Earth in the last several centuries. Exactly. Deterrence through overwhelming superiority. It's really quite elegant. It's terrifying. Same thing, really. The class period was nearly over, and Zekthara realized that she had learned more about human military philosophy in 1 hour than she had in 300 cycles of studying other species. One final question, Gunnery Sergeant Williams. In your opinion, what would it take for humans to consider their response to a threat to be actual overkill? Williams looked thoughtful. Well, I suppose if we completely obliterated an enemy species to the point where archaeologists couldn't figure out that they had ever existed, and then sterilized their entire home system just to be sure, that might be considered slightly excessive. Slightly excessive. Well, we'd probably get some criticism from the historians. They like having stuff to study. As the class filed out, chattering nervously in their various languages, Zechithara remained at her lectern, staring at the holographic display that still showed footage of human military operations. She was beginning to understand why the Galactic Council had been so quick to approve humanity's application for membership. It wasn't because humans were particularly advanced or diplomatic. It was because absolutely nobody wanted to find out what would happen if they said no. In her 300 cycles of teaching, Professor Zechithara had learned about proportional response, tactical efficiency, and the mathematics of warfare from dozens of species. Today, she had learned about the human concept of overkill. She was pretty sure she preferred not knowing,